In the gold-plated grand ballroom of Imperial Crown Hotel, CEO Madeleine Carrington pointed at Evan Hale's worn suit and asked aloud who had let a poor man into her gala. Before 500 of the wealthiest people in New York, she called the single father an opportunist and ordered security to remove him from the floor. Evan had barely taken a step toward the exit when he caught sight of a steel cable above the stage pulling slowly away from its anchor. He lunged forward and dragged Madeleine clear seconds before a 1-ton LED frame came crashing down onto the exact spot where she had been standing. That rescue cost him nothing he hadn't already lost. But in the inside pocket of his old jacket, Evan Hale carried the legal authority to take control of her entire empire. Subscribe and stay until the end to see the man who was humiliated save the CEO and then take command of everything she owned. The night Carrington Dominion celebrated 100 years of existence. Its headquarters sent invitations to 600 of the most powerful people alive, and not one of those invitations carried the name Evan Hale. The ballroom of Imperial Crown Hotel had been rented out entirely, its archways draped in ivory and burnished gold, its tables set with porcelain and crystal under lighting calibrated to make even cautious men feel expansive. New York's wealthiest families arrived in intervals of deliberate timing, politicians moved among hedge fund managers, and investment journalists recorded every handshake with the discipline of people who understood that proximity to power was itself a form of currency. Behind the carefully worded press releases, Madeleine Carrington intended this evening to be something more personal. The night she stepped out of her grandfather's shadow for good by announcing a merger between Carrington Dominion's energy division and Winthrop Capital, a deal framed as proof that the fourth generation of a dynasty could build rather than merely inherit. Evan arrived at the hotel's service entrance with a small metal box tucked under one arm and a sealed letter in the breast pocket of a suit that had not been pressed since his daughter's graduation 2 years prior. He was 45 years old, lean in the way that men become when structure replaces leisure, and his shoes had been resoled twice because he was not the kind of person who replaced something that still worked. He had received a private invitation from Warren Prescott, the Carrington family's senior legal counsel, and a man Evan had not spoken to in 11 years, with a message that was brief and specific. "Come before the main program begins and bring the box Theodore gave you." Because his name appeared nowhere in the guest registry and only in a sealed legal record, the reception staff asked him to wait near the back corridor while they attempted to locate authorization. Evan accepted this without protest, found a position along the wall where the sightlines to the main stage were unobstructed, and began to do what he had always done in any new environment, he observed. Within 4 minutes of standing there, he had noticed 4 things that did not belong, and none of them were about the people in formal wear crossing the marble floor in front of him. The bolt cluster on the LED screen's primary support bracket had been replaced recently, the thread marks still bright against the older steel, and the replacement hardware was visibly lighter than specifications for a frame that size would typically require. The load-bearing cable running from that bracket to the ceiling anchor showed fraying along its inner coil that was not consistent with normal wear. The fraying was too uniform, too deliberate, too clean at its edges. The contractor identification stamped on the scaffolding baseplate did not match any vendor code Evan could trace to the official supplier list he had memorized 11 years ago when he had last worked inside these operations, and while supply chains changed, they did not typically change in ways that made documentation disappear. The security camera mounted to cover that portion of the stage had been rotated a precise 17 degrees, not far enough to be obvious to a casual observer, but far enough to exclude the bolt cluster from its field of view entirely. Evan set the metal box down beside his leg, moved toward the scaffolding, crouched to examine the cable housing, and was still crouching when the sound of clicking heels and animated conversation told him the CEO had arrived with her entourage. Madeline Carrington was 41 years old and carried herself with the specific confidence of someone who had spent decades being the most capable person in most rooms while also needing to prove that fact continually to people who had decided beforehand that she hadn't earned her place. She moved through crowds the way she moved through boardrooms, with deliberate direction, her attention precise and her expression composed, leaving no ambiguity about who was in charge of the space she occupied. Beside her, Blaine Winthrop maintained the practiced proximity of a trusted advisor, his silver hair immaculate, his voice low and reassuring as he guided her toward the stage where microphones and lighting were being finalized. He was 55 years old and had spent 30 of those years building a reputation as the most loyal ally the Carrington family had ever employed, a reputation he had cultivated with the same patience and attention to detail that he had applied to everything else he wanted. When Blaine spotted Evan crouching near the scaffolding, he said something quiet into Madeline's ear, and his expression did not change even slightly as he did it. He told her that the man near the stage equipment was a former employee who had been terminated under difficult circumstances and had made financial demands against the company before his separation was finalized. A man who had been showing up at Carrington events uninvited and who had a documented history of wanting things that didn't belong to him. Madeline stopped walking. Her eyes moved to Evan with the flat, assessing quality of someone performing a rapid threat calculation, and what she saw was a middle-aged man in an unpressed suit crouching next to equipment that belonged to her family at an event she had organized, in a room she had paid for. She crossed the floor in 6 steps and asked in a voice that carried exactly as far as she intended it to, which was far enough that the nearest 30 guests turned their heads, whether he had managed to purchase a ticket or had simply dressed in whatever he found and let himself in. Evan rose to his feet and opened his mouth to explain what he had found with the cable housing. But Madeline spoke again before he completed his first sentence, her words landing with the precision of someone who had practiced dismissal the way others practiced kindness. She said that men like him did not get to touch things that belonged to her family, and she used the phrase men like him without embarrassment, because in that moment, in that room, she was certain of the category she was placing him in and of her right to place him there. She turned to the head of her security detail and told Marcus Dean to remove the man from the building before the program began. Marcus was a large and serious person who understood that his job was to execute decisions, not to audit them, and he began walking Evan toward the main exit with the practiced neutrality of someone removing an obstacle rather than a person. Several guests produced phones. A few laughed in the quiet, instinctive way that groups respond to public humiliation when they are certain it does not involve them. Evan moved without resistance toward the tall doors, the metal box still in his hand, and the last thing he saw as he crossed the threshold of the ballroom was the stage illuminated and waiting, the damaged cable hanging 4 stories above the spot where Madeline Carrington was about to stand. The doors had almost closed behind him when the sound reached him, a high metallic snap from above the stage, followed half a second later by the lower groan of a bracket losing tension. Evan did not deliberate. He turned, pushed past Marcus, and the second guard positioned at the entry covered the distance across the ballroom floor at a pace that cleared the path because people stepped aside rather than be knocked down, vaulted the low railing at the stage edge, and wrapped both arms around Madeline's shoulders as the full assembly, the central LED screen, its reinforced frame, 240 kilograms of steel and display glass, separated from the ceiling mount and fell. He pulled her hard to the left and forward, and the frame struck the stage floor where she had been standing, bounced once and came to rest in a tangle of cable and broken panel, with a sound that temporarily ended all conversation in the room. The impact shook the ceiling fixtures and sent a bloom of fine plaster dust over the front row tables. Madeline had hit her wrist against the stage monitor on the way down, but she was upright, she was conscious, and when the dust had settled enough to see by, she was looking at the man who had just saved her life with an expression that had not yet finished deciding what it was. There was a moment of genuine silence, the kind that follows violence even when no one has been badly hurt, and then the room broke into the layered noise of several hundred people processing the same event simultaneously. Security moved toward the stage. Staff moved toward the fallen equipment. Several guests were already on phones. Blaine Winthrop appeared at the edge of the stage within seconds, and his response was immediate and assured, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. He looked at Evan and told the room that they now had confirmation of what he had suspected from the moment this man was spotted near the equipment, that the disruption had been staged, that a deliberate interference with stage infrastructure, followed by a theatrical intervention, was the kind of calculated attention-seeking he had been warned about, and that security needed to take control of the situation before anyone said anything that could be used in subsequent litigation. Marcus, acting on the most recent authority he had been given, moved toward Evan and told him to step away from the CEO. Natalie Brooks, Carrington Dominion's chief legal counsel, appeared from the left side of the stage, 48 hours of pre-event preparation compressed into the tight focus behind her eyes as she told Evan to put the metal box on the table and keep his hands visible. Evan set the box down and turned it so that the Carrington family crest embossed on its lid faced outward. Marcus opened it, found the sealed legal documents inside, found Evan's identification clipped to their exterior, and went very still. Madeline watched this from 3 feet away, her injured wrist held against her chest, her mind running backward through the sequence of the last 8 minutes. The things Evan had tried to tell her about the cable, the way she had cut him off, the trajectory of the frame and where it had landed, and the fact that the man Blaine had described as a disgruntled intruder had run back into a building he was being ejected from in order to pull her out of the path of something falling at considerable speed. She did not yet say she had been wrong. But she also did not agree when Blaine suggested detaining Evan pending an investigation, and that hesitation was a new thing. When Natalie completed a preliminary check of the scaffolding and found that the replacement bolt cluster had been sourced from a vendor whose authorization originated from Blaine's administrative office, she said so quietly to Madeline, and Madeline's expression shifted in a way that Blaine, watching from 12 feet away, noticed but could not interrupt in time. Warren Prescott entered from the service corridor at 11:47, moving with the controlled haste of a man in his late 60s who had spent 40 years learning when to walk faster without appearing to run. He found Evan surrounded by security personnel and responded with the unambiguous displeasure of someone who had not expected to discover that a guest he had personally vouched for was being treated as a suspect. He informed the room that Evan Hale was a private invitee of the late Chairman Theodore Carrington, that his presence was established through sealed legal documents, and that any authority anyone believed they held over whether this man entered or remained in this building was subordinate to an arrangement that predated most of the people currently standing in it. Blaine attempted to redirect the conversation toward logistics, suggesting the discussion move to a private room. But several people had already heard Warren's statement, and the room's calculations had shifted. Madeline stood at the center of that shift, her wrist aching, her Gala in wreckage, and the man her family's oldest legal counsel was defending having just pulled her clear of something that would have broken her spine. Warren reached into the metal box and produced the first sealed document. He held it open so Madeline could read the title line, a notation confirming that Evan Hale held active status as independent trust protector of the Carrington Continuity Trust, appointed by Theodore Carrington 12 years prior and never revoked. The private meeting room off the ballroom's east corridor held a conference table, 8 chairs, and the kind of silence that forms when people are about to say things they have been avoiding for a long time. Warren laid the Continuity Trust documents across the table in sequence and explained their history without editorializing, the way lawyers explain things when they want the facts to do the work that accusation would only complicate. Theodore Carrington had created the trust 14 years earlier following a period in which he had observed signs within his own board of directors that certain members were positioning to liquidate assets rather than grow them, a pattern he recognized as the early signal of an internal acquisition strategy dressed as fiduciary responsibility. He had structured the trust to hold a small economic stake in the company, but a concentrated block of Class B voting shares that carried special override authority, the kind of authority that could not be diluted, transferred, or voted away by the standard board process. He had needed someone to hold protective power over that trust who had no financial stake in the company, no seat on the board, no title to defend, and no personal connection to any faction within the Carrington family. He had chosen Evan because 11 years earlier, Evan had discovered a procurement fraud network inside the company, documented it, brought it to Theodore personally, and then declined the 7-figure settlement offered to keep him quiet and cooperative. He had simply left the company to raise his daughter and asked for nothing, and Theodore had considered that the most reliable reference a human being could produce. Madeline sat across the table from the documents and from Evan and said nothing for a long moment. When she spoke, she said it clearly. She did not believe her grandfather had the right to assign authority over a family institution to someone the family had never agreed to trust, and she viewed the entire arrangement as a legal instrument designed by an old man who had not trusted his own descendants. Evan did not respond to the hostility in her words. He pushed the sealed letter across the table and said he had never intended to use what the trust gave him and was not planning to start tonight. In the letter, Theodore had written that the greatest threats to institutions were not enemies who attacked from outside, but loyalists who believed their proximity to power entitled them to shape its future without permission. Madeline read the letter twice, set it face down, and looked at Evan with the controlled expression of someone working hard not to show that something had landed. She announced that the merger with Winthrop Capital would proceed on schedule and that the disruption of the evening did not change the strategic rationale. Evan asked if he could look at the merger's summary documents, not as a challenge but as a formality, and Natalie produced them. He read through them with the speed of someone who knew exactly what to look for and stopped on the 3rd page, the 5th page, and the 9th page, each time marking a clause with a brief notation. 3 provisions had been embedded in the agreement in the kind of language that required careful reading to recognize as dangerous. The first gave Winthrop Capital the right to acquire additional Carrington shares at a fixed price if the company's stock dropped 15% within the merger window, a provision that rewarded volatility rather than stability. The second redirected signing authority to the executive vice president if the CEO were suspended or placed on administrative hold before the deal closed, which meant Blaine would complete the transaction without Madeline's involvement, if she were removed under any circumstances. The third allowed a set of manufacturing facilities to be transferred to Winthrop-affiliated entities as payment for restructuring fees, a mechanism that would move core productive assets out of the company for a fraction of their appraised value. Evan explained this without rhetoric, using the specific page numbers and clause references, and said that what had been presented to Carrington's board as a partnership agreement was a structured acquisition designed to execute itself in stages, with each stage triggered by conditions the opposing party could create deliberately. Madeline's response was immediate and dismissive. She told him he had been out of serious finance long enough that he was pattern matching against structures that no longer worked the way he remembered, that the deal had been reviewed by 3 legal teams, and that the instinct to see conspiracy in complex commercial arrangements was a habit of people who had removed themselves from the field and lost perspective on how it actually operated. Evan let her finish, and then he said, without raising his voice, that she had nearly been crushed by a piece of equipment she had trusted someone else to inspect, and that she was now proposing to sign a contract she had trusted someone else to review, and that the mechanism in both cases was exactly the same. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence was broken when Natalie's phone lit up with an alert from the company's financial monitoring system. 3 transactions authorized from Madeline's account credentials had transferred a combined $480 million to accounts registered in jurisdictions that did not share financial disclosure agreements with the United States. The transactions had been processed between 9:17 and 9:44 that evening. Madeline had been standing on the stage at 9:17, visible to every person in the ballroom, and she had been talking to Warren and Evan in this room at 9:44. She had not authorized any transfers. She had not even been near a device. And she knew, with the specific clarity that comes from suddenly understanding a game that has been running around you for months, that the board meeting Blaine would call tomorrow morning was not going to be about protecting the company. The footage began circulating within 3 hours of the gala ending. Not the footage of the stage collapse, but the footage of Madeline pointing at Evan's suit and asking who had let him in. By the time financial markets opened the following morning, Carrington Dominion's share price had dropped 9% on the combination of the stage incident footage, unconfirmed reports about the suspicious transactions, and the generalized anxiety that follows when a company's leadership appears to be in simultaneous crisis. Blaine Winthrop appeared before cameras in the lobby of Carrington Tower at 7:40. Composed and grave, communicating the specific brand of reluctant loyalty he had been performing for decades, saying only that difficult questions needed to be answered about the CEO's conduct and that the board had a responsibility to take those questions seriously. He said nothing specific. He said everything necessary. In a private corridor outside the hotel's executive floor, Blaine visited Madeline's suite and told her, in the voice of a man delivering medicine rather than poison, that a voluntary temporary suspension would allow the investigation to run its course without the distraction of her public role, that her reputation would be better preserved by stepping aside than by contesting a process that had already generated adverse publicity, and that he personally would ensure the company continued operating under responsible leadership while the matter was resolved. He described the path forward with such careful sympathy that the offer sounded almost like protection, until Madeline placed it against everything she now knew about the merger terms and saw it for what it was. Once the outline became visible, it was hard to look away from how precisely it had been constructed. The stage event had needed only to damage her credibility, not to harm her physically. The fraudulent transactions had given the board a charge. The stock drop had activated the merger's acquisition provisions. The suspension would transfer signing authority to Blaine and seal the outcome. Every element had been timed to execute within 36 hours, each one triggering the next. Madeline found Evan in the hallway outside the conference room where Natalie had set up a temporary working station. She walked up to him without her security team or her public presentation. She said she needed him to prove the transactions had been forged. Evan reminded her that she had called him an opportunist in front of 500 people and had ordered him removed from a building where he had been legally invited. She told him to help for the sake of her grandfather's legacy. He declined to be leveraged by sentiment belonging to the one person in the entire arrangement who had treated him honestly. She stood with that, and then she let it go. She said she had been wrong about him. She was not speaking as the CEO of anything, and she was asking because tens of thousands of people would lose their jobs if the institution her family had built over 4 generations was stripped for parts by a man who had spent 30 years pretending to love it. Evan listened to all of it. He agreed with 4 conditions. Full access to every layer of the company's financial systems, no employees dismissed for cooperating with the investigation, complete honesty from Madeline even when that honesty was damaging to her family's reputation, and no interference if the continuity trust provisions were activated. She agreed to all 4. Evan went directly to the transaction timestamps, cross-referenced them against the Gala's event records, and confirmed within 20 minutes that every single transaction had been authorized during a window when Madeline was documented as being in continuous view of several hundred witnesses. The authentication had been generated from a device. He needed to find it. The financial forensics expanded through the night and into the following day. Evan and Natalie traced each of the foreign accounts to parent entities, those entities to holding companies, and those holding companies to a network of vendor relationships quietly built into Carrington Dominion's supply chain over 3 years, beginning almost exactly when Blaine was elevated to executive vice president with oversight of operations. The vendors provided plausible services, safety equipment, factory maintenance, freight insurance, restructuring consultation, event infrastructure. Their invoices appeared properly in the system. Their contracts had been signed. Their tax identification numbers were real. But their physical addresses were virtual offices. Their staffs did not exist in any employment record that survived scrutiny, and their banking relationships followed with sufficient patience, back to a single private fund controlled by the Winthrop Family Trust. Evan calculated the total extraction across 3 years at approximately $940 million, moved in increments deliberately kept below the threshold, requiring board review, each transaction small enough to look like routine operational expenditure and large enough, in aggregate, to represent a sustained looting of the company. The scaffolding contractor for the Gala was one of the vendor entities. This made the stage incident something more than corporate negligence. It was a component of the same system, which meant that whoever had authorized the contractor had also made a decision about what the contractor's people would do to that cable housing and when. Evan showed Madeline the connection without commentary, and she sat with it for a time before she spoke. The discovery that opened a different kind of wound came next. Records showing that her father had flagged Blaine's vendor relationships twice in private communications but had chosen not to escalate, citing the risk that disclosure would depress the stock price. The silence of one generation had given the fraud a decade of additional runway. Madeline did not say much when Evan showed her this. She looked at the documents for a long time. He did not fill the silence with reassurance, and she did not ask for it. Natalie confirmed the destination of the money through a regulatory database query, and the confirmation was clean and damning. A private investment vehicle, bearing the Winthrop family name, structured to receive funds through 7 intermediaries. Before they could complete the data backup, the access credentials for both Madeline and Evan were simultaneously invalidated, and the screen returned a single message: authorization suspended by executive directive. The board convened at 9 the following morning in the top-floor conference room of Carrington Tower. a room designed to communicate authority through its altitude and its view, and the particular quality of light that fell across a table long enough to seat 20. Madeline arrived and found that her chair had been relocated from the head of the table to a position 3 seats from the end, and that Blaine was already seated in the central position beside Reginald Ashcroft, the board's non-executive chairman, arranging papers with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been preparing for a specific meeting for quite some time. The presentation Blaine delivered was thorough. Madeline's authenticated electronic signature on the transfers, recovered emails suggesting contact with foreign investment vehicles, security footage of Evan accessing the restricted stage area during the gala, historical records of a contractual dispute between Evan and Carrington Dominion from 11 years prior, and system logs showing that both Evan and Madeline had accessed restricted financial records the previous evening. Blaine framed this as the picture of a CEO who had lost objectivity and had allowed a person with a documented grievance to help obscure financial wrongdoing behind a manufactured crisis. The board voted to suspend Madeline from all executive functions pending a formal investigation. Her access card was canceled before she stood up from her relocated chair. Blaine immediately proposed a resolution authorizing the Winthrop Capital transaction to proceed under his signature as acting executive head, with a completion timeline of 24 hours. Marcus Dean received instructions to escort both Madeline and Evan from the building. He was walking toward them when Evan placed the metal box on the conference table, slid it to Warren Prescott's position, and said, clearly enough for the full room to hear, that before anyone was escorted anywhere, he would like the Carrington Continuity Trust's emergency provisions to be formally read into the record. Warren opened the box. He read the 3 activation conditions aloud: a CEO suspended through a contested process, a board preparing to transact core assets at below-market terms, and documented evidence of conflicted interest in the acquiring party. He stated, without equivocation, that all 3 conditions had been satisfied simultaneously. Evan Hale signed the activation instrument, and the Trust's Class B voting block moved. The first effect was automatic and immediate. Every board resolution passed or pending in the preceding 48 hours was suspended for 72 hours pending Trust review. The second effect was selective. 3 board members whose financial disclosure statements revealed investment relationships with Winthrop-affiliated entities were removed from voting eligibility for the duration of the suspension period. Blaine looked at the document Warren placed in front of him, and then looked at Evan with an expression that passed through disbelief and arrived at contempt, and said that a man wearing a suit bought for under $500 did not have the credibility or the competence to hold temporary command over a corporation valued at more than $30 billion. Warren Prescott stood, which was a thing Warren Prescott rarely did in meetings, and read the Trust's final declaration. Effective immediately, Evan Hale was appointed interim executive chairman of Carrington Dominion for the duration of the crisis period. The room was completely silent. Marcus Dean, the security director who had walked Evan out of the gala the previous evening, turned toward him and asked, with the careful neutrality of a professional who understood that the structure of authority had genuinely changed, what the chairman's instructions were. Evan looked at Blaine for one moment, without heat and without performance, and gave his first order. All Winthrop-affiliated accounts were to be flagged and restricted. No funds were to leave the building's financial systems under any authorization pending completion of the independent audit, and Blaine Winthrop was not to exit the building until that audit had produced its initial findings. Evan did not go to Madeline's executive office. He set up operations in the audit department on the 14th floor, a room full of workstations and filing systems, and the kind of overhead lighting that was designed for accuracy rather than impression. And he began by doing the things that most needed doing rather than the things that looked most like leadership. The Winthrop transaction was formally suspended. 14 pending termination orders that had been queued for signature were pulled from the approval system and canceled. A formal whistleblower protection notice was issued to all employees informing them that any person who provided information relevant to the ongoing review was legally protected from retaliation. An independent auditing firm was retained and given immediate building access. A company-wide communication informed all staff that payroll obligations for the current and following 2 pay cycles were guaranteed regardless of any structural changes at the board level. The directors who had been most visibly aligned with Blaine's position arrived one by one through the afternoon, some attempting to argue, some attempting to negotiate, and some simply waiting in chairs outside the audit room for a chance to speak with a man they had laughed at in a ballroom 2 evenings before. A division head offered Evan the use of the company's primary aircraft for a scheduled facility visit. Evan declined and directed that 2 of the 4 planes in the Carrington fleet be evaluated for sale, with proceeds applied to the operating reserve as a buffer against the credit disruption. Blaine's legal team was already engineering. He worked through the evening and into the following morning with Natalie and the lead auditor. And at some point, Madeline stood in the doorway and watched him run a $30 billion company. With the same focused economy of motion he applied to everything, without ceremony and without apparent concern for how it appeared from outside the room. She said nothing at first. Then she came in and sat across the table and said she wanted her position back the moment she was cleared. Evan said the position could not simply be restored, as though the crisis had been an interruption rather than a revelation, because the system that had allowed one person to manipulate an entire board needed to be examined and restructured before anyone was given unchecked authority within it. She accused him of using the legal mechanism of the trust to consolidate what her grandfather had built under his own control. He gave her the letter again, the handwritten one from Theodore, and pointed to the paragraph near the end where the old man had written that the trust's protector might need to act against the interests of even a legitimate heir if the heir's judgment had been compromised by proximity to the wrong loyalties. Evan said he was not taking the company from her. He was holding it away from the people she had trusted to stand beside her, and who had been positioned precisely there in order to reach around her. He said it without accusation, as a description of what the evidence showed. The conversation was not resolved that night. Blaine's counter-offensive arrived through the banking system. Documents submitted to 3 of Carrington's primary lenders argued that Evan's assumption of authority was procedurally irregular, raising the possibility that credit facilities might be reviewed under a governance uncertainty assessment. The stock price fell another 6%. Natalie confirmed that if the credit lines froze, the company would struggle to meet a large bond payment due in 41 days, and that Blaine's team had a standing offer ready. If Carrington declared a liquidity event, Winthrop Capital would step in as a priority buyer for 11 subsidiaries at approximately 30% of appraised value. The clock was running, and Evan had fewer than 24 hours before the financial pressure became structural rather than reputational. Evan spent those hours building the appearance of a retreat. He authorized a company statement suggesting that Carrington Dominion's board was open to considering asset sales as part of a financial stabilization plan, and he allowed that statement to reach the financial press in a form that suggested the primary assets under consideration were in the energy division, which was exactly what Blaine's acquisition plan required. Blaine received this signal through an intermediary and interpreted it as Evan reaching the limits of his authority under pressure, a man who had found himself holding a position too large for someone with his background and resources. The proposal that came back through Blaine's legal representative was comprehensive and detailed in the way that only a plan prepared well in advance could be. Blaine offered to suspend the investigation, provide $20 million to Evan personally, arrange a resolution for Madeline that would keep her clear of criminal exposure by attributing the fraudulent transactions to a mid-level officer, proceed with the asset purchases at the negotiated prices, and grant Evan a ceremonial board seat for 12 months before the trust was dissolved. Embedded in its third paragraph was the assumption that Evan's primary motivation was personal gain, and that everyone, given sufficient pressure, eventually found their number. Evan sent back an acceptance and named the venue, the Imperial Crown Hotel, the same room where the gala had been held 2 evenings before, the following afternoon. Madeline, when informed, was certain Evan had decided to sell. She confronted him directly and asked whether he was genuinely planning to do what the communication implied. He did not explain the full construction of what he had arranged, and she had to sit with her uncertainty through the night in the particular discomfort of having extended trust to someone and being unable to verify that the extension had been warranted. This was not comfortable for her. It was, in its own way, the experience Evan had been living for 2 days while she processed whether to believe him. Blaine arrived at the hotel the following afternoon in a good mood, which was unusual for him because he considered displayed confidence a form of vulnerability. He was confident because he believed the morning's development confirmed a theory he had held for years, that institutions built on inherited authority were fundamentally fragile at their core, and that the Carrington family had survived as long as it had primarily because no one with real ambition had been positioned closely enough to apply sustained pressure at the right points simultaneously. He said as much during the early portion of the meeting, framing it as perspective rather than admission. He acknowledged the vendor network's function in general terms, confirmed that Madeline's credentials had been used without her knowledge, and avoided, with great precision, any direct reference to instructions he may have given regarding the stage equipment. Evan placed 2 documents before him. They appeared nearly identical. Blaine read the first page of the one placed closest to his hand, confirmed it matched the agreed terms, and signed at the bottom without progressing to the clause on page 6, which required the signatory to confirm that all vendor entities referenced in the attached schedules were under the commercial control and beneficial ownership of the party executing the agreement. Natalie entered the room with a forensic auditor and 2 representatives from the primary lending institutions who had been in a separate room since the meeting began. She indicated that the full conversation had been recorded under the applicable legal provisions, and that the recording would be made available to the relevant financial regulatory bodies by 5 o'clock. Madeline entered behind them, and she said the hotel's security system had recovered additional footage from the night of the gala. Footage showing Blaine's personal assistant delivering the replacement bolt cluster to the stage crew at 6:40 in the evening, 3 hours before the program began. Blaine said that this proved nothing about his instructions, that an assistant handling a logistics matter was not evidence of his knowledge or intent. Evan then produced the final element, the device used to generate Madeline's fraudulent digital signatures was a dedicated hardware authenticator, a physical token, the kind that could not be replicated without the original device. That device had created an automatic encrypted backup of its activity log each time it was used. The backup was not stored on Carrington's corporate servers, which would have been accessible to the system administrator, who cleared the company's storage of relevant records on the morning after the gala. It was stored on a personal cloud account connected to a tablet registered in Blaine's name because the device had been configured to use that account as its backup destination by someone who had not anticipated that a record of every use would be preserved in a location outside the company's control. Blaine's expression changed for the first time in the conversation. Before anyone could reach the room's network controls, he had used his phone to initiate a final transfer of $600 million from the last unfrozen Carrington account. Evan had expected this. He had expected it because the structure of the entire plan told him that whoever had designed it would have built a final extraction mechanism for the scenario in which everything collapsed, a last movement of capital before the accounts were fully locked. He had spoken to the Financial Regulatory Authority the previous evening and arranged for a monitoring protocol to be placed on any outgoing transfer above $1 million from any Carrington-associated account, without blocking those transfers immediately, because a blocked transfer could be rerouted, but a completed transfer that moved through a monitored network left a complete transactional record. The $600 million moved through 4 intermediate accounts in 40 minutes, and the regulatory team followed it to its destination without obstruction, because Evan had needed it to arrive. It arrived in the Winthrop Family Fund's primary account, and the movement itself constituted the final and cleanest piece of evidence connecting Blaine's private financial interests directly to the fraud that had been running inside Carrington Dominion for 3 years. The accounts were frozen before the transfer cleared the domestic banking system. The majority of the funds stolen over the prior years were also recoverable through the same transactional network. At the special shareholder session convened 4 days later, Evan presented the complete picture without theater, the vendor network and its mechanism, the stage event and its connection to the broader financial structure, the forgery of Madeline's authentication credentials, the stock manipulation designed to activate the merger's acquisition provisions, and the intended disposition of strategic assets at prices representing a fraction of their real value. Blaine was suspended pending referral to the relevant authorities. 3 board members who had assisted in the suspension proceeding against Madeline resigned before the session concluded. Madeline was formally cleared of the financial charges. Evan stood before the assembled shareholders and said that she bore no responsibility for the theft and had not authorized any of the transactions attributed to her. He also said that she bore a different kind of responsibility, one that could not be dissolved by an investigation's findings. Responsibility for creating and maintaining an environment where the staff members who had noticed anomalies in vendor billing over several years had not believed they could bring those anomalies forward without professional risk, and where the culture of deference to senior leadership had provided more protection to the fraud than any technical mechanism. This was harder to hear than the exoneration, and he said it because it was true and because an institution that emerged from the crisis without that accounting would be vulnerable to the same dynamic again. Madeline listened. She did not argue. She stood before the company's employees in the main auditorium the following week and said that she had publicly humiliated a man who had come to her event with information that could have prevented everything that followed, that she had done so on the basis of his clothes and what she had been told by the person running the fraud, and that the ease with which she had accepted that assessment said something about her that the investigation had not addressed. She apologized to Evan directly, in front of several hundred people, without condition. The board's reconstituted membership offered Evan the permanent executive chairmanship. He accepted on the condition that governance be restructured to include a standing employee advisory council, a permanent independent audit function reporting directly to the trust rather than to any single executive, and a formal review process for any transaction above a defined threshold. Madeline asked when she would get the company back. He said it wasn't about getting it back. A thing returned to a single set of hands was still a thing that could be taken from a single set of hands, and it needed to become a system instead. 6 months after the gala, the company was stable. The vendor extraction network had been dismantled, and the asset recovery process, though incomplete, had returned a substantial portion of the stolen funds to the operating accounts. The factories that had been scheduled for sale at distressed prices were operating. The credit lines that had been threatened were extended once the investigation's findings were made available to the lenders. Payroll was met for every cycle through the resolution period. Evan remained in the executive chairman position and did not relocate to the building's upper floors, did not use the company's remaining aircraft for personal travel, and did not accept the security detail offered as a function of his title. He continued to live in the same house where he had raised his daughter through years of school plays and early mornings, and when Lydia came home for the academic break, they had dinner at the kitchen table and argued about economic theory and its real-world limits, which was the most enjoyable conversation Evan had in some time. Madeline returned to an operational role 6 months into the transition, carrying the title of Chief Executive Officer, but now operating within a governance structure that required board approval for decisions that had previously been within her sole discretion, and reporting to a chairman who had been brought in to protect the institution rather than to serve her interests or her family's preferences. She had not expected to find this arrangement workable. She found it more workable than she anticipated, because Evan was consistent in a way she had not been prepared for. He did not relitigate decisions after they were made, did not use his position to accumulate deference, and was equally direct with her when she was right and when she was wrong, which she found genuinely disorienting at first, and eventually, in a way that was difficult to articulate, something close to reliable. For the first anniversary event following the crisis, Madeline did not rent the ballroom at Imperial Crown. She organized the gathering in a manufacturing facility that had been 3 weeks from sale when the investigation began, a building full of working machinery and people who had spent the year uncertain whether they would keep their jobs, and she invited those workers to occupy the seats nearest the front of the room. The evening's program was shorter and less ornate than any Carrington event in recent memory, and the catering was from a local business rather than an imported team, and Madeline stood at the entrance and greeted people herself rather than being announced from a distance. Evan arrived in the same suit he had worn to the gala, the one with the slightly worn lapels and the shoes resoled more than once, because he had not bought a new one, and because the idea of doing so as a gesture to the moment had not occurred to him as a priority. Madeline met him at the entrance without security and without formality, and stood beside him in full view of everyone in the room, and she said to the assembled gathering that the man beside her had saved her life on a stage in a hotel ballroom and had then saved the institution her family had built, and that she had tried to have him removed from the building before either of those things happened, and that what she had learned from the sequence was that the size of a person's authority said very little about the substance of their judgment, and that she had spent a long time confusing the two. After the event, walking through the facility's main floor with the equipment running its night shift around them, she asked when the full transition would be complete, when the governance restructuring would be finished, and the crisis period officially behind them. He said those questions pointed in the wrong direction. The goal was not to arrive at a finished state, but to build something durable enough that no single ambition could find a seam in it large enough to pull apart. She stood with that and said she thought she understood what he meant. They watched the machinery for a while. Then she asked why he had come back into the building at the gala, after everything she had said. after the security escort to the door, after the crowd's laughter had followed him across the lobby. The floor machinery turned, and the light held steady on both of them. And Evan gave his answer without looking away from the work being done in front of him. He said that becoming a better person than she had assumed him to be was the only answer worth giving to what she had done, and that it had been enough then, and it was still enough now, which was why he had not needed it to become anything else.